Ready to dive into a real head-scratcher, Jack the Ripper. Still got us talking all these years later.
A case that never really closes, does it?
Exactly. And we've got a mountain of stuff to sift through today. Excerpts from Cannell M. Gold's book, right? Jack the Ripper, the 2012 one. Full of actual documents, not just someone's theories.
An invaluable resource.
Yeah.
Gets you closer to what they knew then, not just what we think now.
Right to the source. So we're not just rehashing the same old Ripper stories everyone's heard. Let's get into the nitty-gritty, the victims, what the investigators were doing, all of it. But gotta set the scene first, right? Can't talk Whitechapel without.
1888, London. Picture the fog, the gaslight, but also the stark divide. You've got unimaginable wealth, and right alongside it, the East End, Whitechapel, poverty, crime.
Breeding ground for the 11 murders everyone always lumps together, even though.
Not all Jack's work, exactly.
Right, and that's where the color coding in this book is genius. Green for the early ones, yellow for.
The canonical five. Those are the ones that really solidified the Ripper's M.O., at least in the public's eye. August to November 1888, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and of course, Mary Jane Kelly.
The names everyone knows. But we're starting even earlier, right? April 88, Emma Smith. Brutal attack, even if it doesn't scream Jack right away.
Shows us what these women were up against. Source mentions these high-rip gangs preying on prostitutes.
High rip? What is that, like some Victorian street gang?
Basically. But imagine extorting money for protection from women who are already the most vulnerable. Whitechapel was a rough place.
Then you've got Martha Tabram, just days before the canonical five really begin. 39 stab wounds.
But even here, experts are like, hold on.
Yeah, the sheer frenzy of it. It's brutal, no question, but different. Ripper was controlled, almost surgical later on. This could be a copycat, someone riding on the fear, or just a whole other tragedy.
Adds to the whole mess, right. Trying to untangle this web.
Yeah.
So Polly Nichols, first of the canonical five, what jumps out at you about her case?
The sheer amount of paperwork. Witness statements galore. What Polly was wearing, who she talked to, even the weather that night, it's all there.
And the way she was found, I mean, the details are all right there in the source material, and it's chilling. Not for the faint of heart, that's for sure.
But back then, those details weren't just morbid curiosity. It was all they had to go on. No fancy forensics, no DNA testing, just pure observation. Which makes it all the more fascinating to read now, honestly. But okay, moving on. Just a few weeks later, you've got Annie Chapman. What's the detail that gets you about her?
The missing uterus. That's where you start to see this isn't just about violence. There's something else going on there, something deliberate.
And they even interviewed this woman, Elizabeth Long, who might have seen Annie with her killer right before. How much stock could they even put in eyewitness accounts back then, though?
Tricky. Street lighting was terrible. People were afraid. Memories get hazy. It makes you wonder, how reliable could any of it be?
Right. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing or, like, warped. But the source, it even gets into what tools they thought the Ripper might have used based on Annie's autopsy.
That's what they had to work with. The human mind, trying to make sense of the unthinkable.
Makes you appreciate how much we take for granted now. Okay, Elizabeth Stride. Third of the canonical five. Hers is almost the opposite problem, isn't it?
Yeah, she wasn't mutilated as badly, just the throat slit. It's almost like he was interrupted. Shortest inquest of them all, according to the source.
Someone walked by. He got spooked. We'll never know. But then, not even an hour later, Catherine Eddowes.
And it's even more gruesome this time. This is where we get into the Dear Boss letter, the Lust kidney. The whole thing takes on another level.
Hold on, let's unpack that, Catherine, first. What happened?
Mitre square. Same M.O. throat cut, abdomen slashed. But this time, her left kidney was gone.
The source does not hold back on the details there, let me tell you. And again, it's like whoever did this, they knew their way around the human body.
And that just adds to the mystery, doesn't it? Was it someone with medical training? A butcher? Or just someone with a very disturbing hobby?
Leads us right to those letters, Dear Boss. And then sending a kidney to George Lusk, head of that vigilance committee. Was that legit? Or just someone messing with them?
100 years later, people are still arguing about it. Dear Boss brags about the murders, even threatens to take someone's ears next. Then the kidney shows up. Talk about a calling card.
And they're not even sure if it was a woman's kidney, right? The source mentions some thought it belonged to someone who drank a lot. Others said it was a student prank.
Chaos. Exactly what the killer or someone pretending to be wanted. Even if they weren't real clues, they had the whole city terrified.
And the newspapers weren't helping, were they?
Newspapers were the internet back then. Big headlines, scary stories. People ate it up. Another victim of the fiend, stuff like that. Imagine the pressure on the police.
It's like the Ripper case became this morbid entertainment, fueling itself.
Exactly, and that's a key point, because it makes you wonder, was the killer reading those papers too? Getting off on the attention? We know that's not uncommon.
Chilling thought. All right, Mary Jane Kelly. Last of the canonical five, and easily the most disturbing.
Several things make her case different. First, she wasn't killed on the street. It happened in her room. And the mutilation, it went far beyond the others.
The source describes it as, well, I won't repeat it, but it's clear this wasn't just about killing anymore.
Right, and being in her own room, it suggests a level of familiarity, maybe even control, that's different from the others. Plus, her heart was missing from the scene.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire. People must have gone wild with speculation after that.
Oh, absolutely. Theories about everything. Was he keeping trophies? Were there more victims? Was he some kind of monster who, well, you can imagine.
It's interesting the source also mentions a fire in Mary Jane's room. Any theories on that?
Another little detail that gets people talking, was he trying to burn evidence? Or was it just cold that night? We'll probably never know.
So many questions, and those are just the canonical five. We haven't even touched on Reese Mylett, Alice Mackenzie, the torso in Pynchon Street.
Each one another piece of the puzzle. Some with similarities to the Ripper style, some less so. And that just makes it harder to separate what's connected and what's not.
Like trying to track a single footprint in a blizzard.
Exactly. But that's what we're here for, right? To look closer, see what we can find.
It's wild, right? You'd think with all these reports, all these witnesses, we'd have them by now. But Jack's just slippery, I guess.
It's the historical context, too,
Yeah.
Forensics was in its infancy. No DNA analysis, no fancy databases, just trying to piece it together with what they could see.
And the newspapers breathing down their necks the whole time, probably making things worse instead of better.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine every little detail blown up, rumors flying. Did it help the investigation? Doubtful. Might have even given the killer ideas, knowing what we know now about these types.
Like with those letters, even if they were fake, someone was playing right into that chaos.
Speaking of, those letters are fascinating, aren't they? The Dear Boss letter, the Lust Kidney. Even now, we can't say for sure if they were genuine or just some morbid prank, but they became part of the Ripper's story, didn't they? Added to the myth, the fear.
People love a good mystery, but this is next level. So how do we even approach it then? All these years later, trying to figure out what's real and what's just the story taking over.
It's tough, no doubt. You had to be so careful with every piece of information. Who wrote it? Why? What were they trying to prove? Even this book, we have to read between the lines sometimes.
Like that thing about the Ripper being left-handed, just throws everything you thought you knew out the window.
Exactly. We get so caught up in the image, the myth. But the truth is, we're seeing it all through our own lens, Our own time, our own fears.
Makes you wonder, are we any closer to the truth than they were back then? Or are we just telling different versions of the same story with the same gaps?
That's the question, isn't it? We're drawn to these mysteries, to the darkness. But what does it tell us about ourselves?
Okay, so big picture time. We're wrapping up this deep dive soon. If our listeners are out there hooked on this case like we are, what should they be thinking about? What's the real takeaway here?
I'd say remember the victims. These women, their lives cut short. That's the tragedy, not just the puzzle. And look at Whitechapel itself, the poverty, the danger. That's the context you can't ignore. It's easy to get lost in the whodunit, but the why, that's where the real understanding is.
Gets you thinking, that's for sure. It's almost like we've got too much information, newspapers, letters, rumors. How do you even separate what matters in the Jack the Ripper case?
It's the enduring mystery, isn't it? You've got all these details, these supposed glimpses into the killer's mind, and yet we're still no closer to a definitive answer.
It's true. We've been digging into this all day, and honestly, I'm more hooked now than when we started.
That's the power of the unknown, right? The human mind craves answers, and when we don't have them, we fill the gaps with stories. And Jack the Ripper, perfect story material, unfortunately.
And let's not forget how much pop culture loves a good Ripper tale. Books, movies, even video games. It's like the legend keeps growing.
Exactly. Each generation puts its own spin on it, which is why we have to be so careful, even now, about what we take as fact. Just because it's written down doesn't make it true. Who's doing the writing? What were they trying to prove?
It's about looking at the bigger picture, right? Not just the blood and the mystery.
Absolutely. Take that whole idea of Jack being some brilliant surgeon because of the mutilations. That says more about how we see those professions, the awe, maybe a little fear. But back then, A butcher would have known just as much about anatomy.
We're putting our own ideas onto the past. Like that thing about him only targeting prostitutes. Most of the victims, sure, but can we say that for certain with what we know?
We have to be careful about making assumptions. Some theories even suggest he might have known some of his victims personally. It's all speculation without more evidence, and that's what makes this case so fascinating and so frustrating. We're left with this void, and our minds can't help but try to fill it in.
So where does that leave us? We've walked the streets, looked at the evidence. What's the message for our listeners? What should they take away from all this?
Remember the women, those 5, and all the others caught up in this. Their lives, their stories, that's what matters. And Whitechapel itself. The poverty, the danger for women. That's the context. Don't let the mystery overshadow the human cost.
Because sometimes the darkest stories reveal more than just a killer. They show us who we are, what we fear. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.